Welcome back to the Introduction to Watercolor class. Today we will be painting a small still life of 3 objects with a simple background. Those of you who have been watching the previous lessons know that we've been painting very simple objects with no background. This lesson will be increasing the level of challenge and adding more interest to the painting. Here's a look at the subject I'll be painting. It consists of red and yellow artificial peppers, a glass jar that is partially filled with water, a butter knife in the jar, and a simple dark background. You can screenshot this image and use it as your source for this painting, or you can create your own still life with similar objects. Try to find a photo or arrange a still life with a strong single light source so you have plenty of value contrast and cast shadows. Here are some things to consider when selecting or creating a still life for painting. First is the importance of including background. In this still life, you can see many areas of highlight and reflected light that are visible because they contrast against the dark background. This allows for the use of pure white and extremely light colors in these places, and it accentuates them. Also, background adds implied depth and a sense of atmosphere and mood. Another consideration is the number of objects. In this still life, I consider the jar, water, and butter knife as one object for a total of 3. Personally, I like odd numbers in still lifes, and I believe many other artists do too. There's no perfect number, but adding too many objects can look busy, and not enough objects sometimes lacks interest. Next, let's consider the arrangement of the objects. This arrangement has both overlapping and negative space. I've cropped the top of the knife so we can zoom in closer to the objects and fill more of the paper. It's asymmetrically balanced, which adds more interest. The objects are positioned toward the left side, but balanced by the cast shadows. There's also some eye movement, following the diagonal from the butter knife leading to these planes created by the peppers, then moving through the cast shadows left to right. One special challenge in this still life are the reflections and refractions seen in the glass jar. Many beginning artists can get overwhelmed by the thought of painting glass. It helps to forget that you are painting glass and view this object as a puzzle of abstract shapes with different values and color. If we get the sizes, shapes, and colors fairly accurate, then it will look convincingly real. Now, before we get started, I'll be referring to some terms and techniques from previous lessons without fully explaining them in this video. You may want to watch those before trying this lesson. Also, I'll be speeding up and eliminating some parts of the video footage to save time, so I'll try to condense things down to the essentials. I've taped down the paper, which is 90-pound weight cold press paper, and it's time to start the contour drawing. Let's start with the pepper on the right. We want to envision how large the pepper and the other objects will be and their location on the paper. This helps us to decide where on the paper to begin the drawing. These peppers are more than just simple spherical shapes. They have many planes and angles to them, so we need to lightly plot these sides and angles. I'm using a very light touch for this. If you're having trouble getting light lines, try holding further back on the pencil and just letting its own weight create the pressure. Now that we have the outer edges drawn, we'll turn our attention to the stem and the indentation around it. Now we'll adjust some of the shapes and use a little more pressure to emphasize them. Let's include some interior edges for that form that projects out of the pepper. And I'll make a few little adjustments. That looks good. Now let's start in the glass jar. I want to estimate the negative space between it and the other pepper as I lightly sketch the right side. We'll very lightly draw an ellipse several times for the curve of the bottom, and sketch the vertical line for the left side. Now we'll estimate the location of the shoulder in relation to the top of the pepper and draw several very light ellipses. We'll use the upper stem as a reference to estimate the height of the jar's rim. We'll draw an ellipse for the bottom of the threading and one above for the lip. We want to keep all of these lines extremely light so we can adjust things as we need. Now we'll sketch the curve of the shoulder. We'll take some time to check for symmetry on each side. We'll use another ellipse to draw the water line in the jar. And now we'll plot the angle of the yellow pepper, where the side of it overlaps the jar, and sketch in the angles of the bottom. Now we'll emphasize those edges a little. Now let's draw the top of the pepper that's facing this way. We'll get all those angles and planes. And now the stem and those indentations coming out from the stem. We'll lightly sketch some of the edges of the cast shadows from the yellow pepper, the jar, and the red pepper. Now let's draw the knife and reflections in the glass jar. The bottom of the knife is magnified from the water. This section is more slender where we are looking through the top surface of the water. Now we'll draw this part of the knife that comes out of the water. It's even thinner and bends at a different angle. We see an uneven distortion along the edge of it. And now we'll draw the top of the knife coming out of the jar. You can see how the water and glass distort both the angle and the size of different sections of the knife. Now let's draw some of the reflective shapes we see in the glass jar. It's best just to see these as abstract shapes of value and color. We're including a background as well, so I'll lightly draw the back edge of the table and how it curves from the distortion of the glass jar and continues on the right side. Now let's make sure those line up and that they're horizontal. I think we're ready to paint. For this lesson, we'll paint each object separately. That will make it easier to explain and to demonstrate. We'll start with the red pepper on the right. My lightest color is a combination of orange and red in fairly equal amounts. This color will go around the highlight areas. The next color is pure red. This will go in the middle value areas, which are very intense. We'll need a good amount of this color, so I'll make a large puddle. The darkest color is a mixture of red with some green added. It should have more red than green. This will neutralize and darken the red to make a very deep shadow red. Here's what these look like on our test paper. We have arranged from light to dark and warm to cool. We'll start by painting around those highlights. We need to be careful around the edge and really study the shapes and locations of the highlights. There's an odd-shaped curved highlight on the left side that we'll avoid, and fill in more near the bottom, and under those highlights toward the top. I'm avoiding a section that I'll fill in with pure red a bit later. Let's fill in more of this side of the pepper. There's a little reflected light at the bottom that we'll leave unpainted. And we'll add this in the upper right around the stem. Now we'll get our pure red color and dab into that depression to the left of the stem. And fill in that area that we left white. That other little white spot will be reflected light. Let's dab this in a few other areas that are darker. Next to the stem and down the right side. Those white areas will be places we see reflected light. Now we'll get our shadow color and paint next to that small white spot of paper and to the right of that larger blank area. And let's fill in the bottom underneath that reflected light. I see more pure red that I'll add in there. Now before this dries, let's soften some edges of the highlights. We'll soften these along the top edge first. We don't need to do too much softening with these very thin highlights. Remember that to soften an edge, you want to clean off your brush, then dry it off slightly on a sponge or a paper towel so it's semi-wet, and then dab or drag it along the edge of an area of wet paint to create a blurry edge. Now we'll get the one on the left side. This one fades and blends, especially toward the bottom. Now let's soften and blend the reflected light on the bottom. This pepper has a very reflective surface, so many of these areas of reflected light are almost as light as highlights. Next we'll blend in the reflected light in the form shadow on the right. And we'll add some dark shadow red along the bottom and blend it just a little. I see a few areas I want to add more pure red, so I'll do that. I'm working quickly on this so the colors are able to bleed and blend into the previous layers of paint. Now let's soften this little spot of reflected light and the other one to the right of it. Now we need to add more of our darkest color in the shadows. That contrast will make it more three-dimensional. I see a few more areas to soften again, especially the highlights. And I'll lift out some areas of reflected light a bit more. You can see that as the paint blends and dries, some of those darker areas get lighter over time. So let's add more red. And now we'll mix more dark red and add it into the core shadow. There's actually more than one. Each of those bumps on the right have a core shadow. Now this is starting to dry a little. I'll use a straight red to soften some of the edges of the core shadow. Now we're starting to get that really nice contrast. We'll use red-orange to soften those edges a little more. We're just refining this by adding more contrast and softening the edges. This is a more complex form than the objects we've painted in the previous lessons, so it takes a little more time. That pepper looks good for now. I'll let that dry while I clean the palette. We'll paint in the stems of both peppers later. Now let's mix our colors for the yellow pepper. The lightest color is pure yellow. The second color is yellow with some orange added to it. Our third color, which is for the middle shadow tones, is mostly yellow with some violet and orange added. Last, for our darkest shadows, we'll mix yellow with a lot of violet. This makes a nice dark earthy neutral color. Here's what those look like on our test paper. I think that'll work out nicely. We'll start out with our lightest yellow and paint around the highlight that's above the stem. There's a small reflection we'll paint around also. Now let's get the yellow-orange and dab it around that yellow. And in the darker places on the pepper. Almost the rest of it. Except for the stem and some reflected light along the bottom. Let's soften some edges of the highlight now. And that reflection on the side. I'll dab some yellow-orange into the center of it. And I'll soften the edges. It sort of has a diamond shape. And now we'll soften the reflected light on the bottom. Now let's get the dark yellow and dab it into the form shadows. On the front around the stem. And we'll just fill in the stem. It's okay to go over that because we'll be painting green over top of it later on. There's a little reflection that will leave white. Now let's paint these two darker shadows on the side. In the middle around that reflection and near the bottom. And we'll go back into a few spots with another layer of color to darken them. Now it's time to put in the darkest shadows with the last color we mixed. This is the core shadow between the areas of light and reflected light. We'll use some yellow-orange and the dark yellow to soften and blend some places next to that dark shadow we just painted. Now we'll get a clean brush and soften the reflection to the left of the stem. I see some orange in that shadow under the stem. I'll mix some orange in with the darkest color and paint that underneath the stem and beside it. Let's dab that on the back edge as well. That looks good so far. We'll dry that off a bit with a heat gun and clean off the palette. We're going to paint both stems now, so let's mix the colors we need for that. The lightest color is just yellow. The second color is yellow with a little green added. Our third color is green with red to create a dark shadowy green. You can see how they look on the test paper. That should work out well. Let's start with the stem of the red pepper by dabbing in yellow and avoiding the highlights. Now we'll fill in our yellow-green color just about everywhere else in the stem. Now let's dab the dark green into the shadows on the right side of the stem and a stroke around the center. That can just bleed and blend together as we work on the yellow pepper. Let's get our yellow-green color and fill it in that hexagonal shape of the stem. I'm going to mix a little more dark green with less water and add that in a few places to create the look of the stem. This is similar to a dry and wet technique. We'll touch a few edges to create a shadow. And we'll leave that alone. I think that looks good. Let's dry that with the heat gun. A hair dryer works just as well. Now we'll clean the palette to mix colors that we need for the glass jar and the butter knife. We'll be mixing a total of 5 colors. For 3 of them we'll use a combination of blue and brown. This will create a great neutral color to reproduce the warm and cool gray tones that we see in the glass. We'll create 3 mixtures from light to dark by adjusting the amount of water. The more water, the lighter the color. We can also adjust the amount of blue or brown in each mixture to create a warmer or cooler gray. Here's the lightest color with the most water added. Here's the middle tone with less water. And here's the darkest color with the least amount of water added to it. Next we'll mix pure black with a little water for our darkest shadow areas. Last we'll mix a puddle of red for a few areas where we can see some reflection of the red pepper, especially in the knife. We'll start with a middle value gray and dab it in the various shapes that are this value or darker. Rather than me describing the placement of every stroke, I'll just explain the mental approach I'm using to paint this. When painting reflective and refractive objects made of things like metal and glass, I find it best to think of them as an arrangement of puzzle piece shapes that fall into 5 general values. The lightest are white highlights left the color of the paper. Then light, middle, and dark value areas. And last we have black or near black for the darkest values. We'll just fill these shapes in with the correct value and soften edges or blend where we need to. It's important not to overthink it or figure out the cause of each reflection. As you improve your skills, you can think more critically about the lighting circumstances that cause certain reflections in your future paintings. Right now we're just learning how to represent what we see in front of us. So we'll plug in these different gray values where we see them. Here on this section of the butter knife, we'll add some red to show that reflection of the pepper. And we'll just continue adding these colors into the right shapes. We want to keep a clean edge around the yellow pepper, so we'll be careful as we paint next to the top of it. That contrast is important to show the overlapping. You can see we're also being very careful to leave white paper for the bright highlights. Something that characterizes reflective surfaces are these divisions of light and dark values with intense contrast. We need to emphasize these contrasts right around the water line in the jar. There's not a shortcut for painting this glass jar. We just need to slow down and focus on those abstract value shapes and get them to be the right shape and color or value. We also need to look for shapes that blend from dark to light or have soft edges. We'll add a little more red in the part of the knife that's extending out of the water. Again, we don't want to consider why we see these patterns and divisions of light and dark value. We just want to do our best to accurately paint them in. We don't need to paint every single detail when painting a reflective object like this one. If we try to do that, we can easily become overwhelmed when trying to paint it. A good method to use for simplifying the shapes and colors we're seeing is to squint our eyes to the point where our vision is slightly blurred. This helps to eliminate minute details so we can focus on more general color and value areas. As we paint in the rim of the jar, we want to leave some white linear highlight shapes for the threading. Let's paint the lighter gray values in the top part of the jar. Now we'll paint the handle of the butter knife. We'll put in the lighter gray color shapes and soften that highlight. Now let's dry this off a little so we can put in some smaller dark areas without too much of the color bleeding into the others. We'll paint some of the darker shapes in the knife and do some softening and blending. There's gradation from dark to light as it travels from the bottom to the top of the handle. Let's dry that a little bit more. Now we'll paint in some of the very darkest areas we see. I see a hint of red in a few places. We'll blend those in. And now we'll dab in the darkest areas we see in the other parts of the jar, like those parts of the knife that we can see through the threaded rim. Some places around the knife, on the right side of the jar, and around the rim. We just have to scan the image for places that we see this very dark color. There are a few more places I see just a hint of red. I'll add that to some of the watered down gray, and we'll just add that in a few places. I'm almost done with the jar. I'm just adding a few things and refining it now. Now we'll dry that off and work on the background. The same neutral colors we used on the jar will be used to paint the background. So we'll mix and add to those puddles of color. Starting with the darkest gray color, we'll paint just above the line of the edge of the tabletop and start filling in the background. I'm working quickly because I'll be adding other colors that we want to bleed and blend together, but I'm still being very careful around the edges of the overlapping objects. As we paint more toward the top, we'll add the lightest gray to create a gradation. On the photo source I'm using, you can see an old cabinet and bottom of a door in the background. I'm not trying to paint those, but I am going to imply some of the colors and shapes that I see back there, just to create some variety in the background. I see more of a warm dark neutral beside the knife handle, so I've added a little more brown to the dark gray mixture. I'll carefully paint along the highlight edge of the handle to make that stand out. We're painting quickly and letting this all blend together. This will create a nice sense of distance with a blurred, shadowy background. We'll leave that left side alone for now and start painting on the right side of the background with our dark gray color. I'll carefully go around the edge of the jar. Getting exact colors for the background's not important. As long as it's fairly dark and blurred, that's all that's important. I'm really just using a variegated wash here of different neutral tones to fill around the objects so they contrast with the background. I'll dab in a few dark accents to create contrast. Before that left side dries, we should soften the edge between the table and the background. We want it to look slightly out of focus. Now let's work back into the right side. I see a warmer gray in there, so let's add some orange to our mixture and dab that in so it bleeds into the other colors. And we'll use the darkest gray to go right around and between the jar and the red pepper to create contrast. There's a dark edge to the right of the cabinet. I like that element, so let's add in a dark vertical there. It's almost a repetition of the knife handle. And we'll continue working across with the lighter gray. We're not being very particular here. We're just varying the amount of blue and brown or orange to get some warm and cool variation. Now we'll add some black accents, especially next to the reflected light on the red pepper to emphasize it. And now we'll soften the edge. See how that blurred edge recedes into the background to create some depth. Now the only things left to paint are the cast shadows. We'll use the same 4 neutral colors for the cast shadows that we did for the jar. Let's replenish some of those puddles we mixed earlier so we have a range from light gray to black. Using the middle gray color, we'll start painting the cast shadow under the yellow pepper, carefully shaping the bottom edge, and we'll drag it toward the right. Now we'll add the lightest gray to the outer edge of the cast shadow and create that uneven shape. Let's add some yellow-orange to it for color reflection and just let that bleed and blend. While it's still wet, we'll add black next to the bottom of the pepper in the cast shadow. And now we'll use a clean semi-wet brush to soften the outer edges. Now we'll use a little yellow-gray to soften and blend the edge between the pepper and the shadow. We'll let that go and move on to the other objects. I'll remix some of our middle gray color and we'll use that to paint under the red pepper We'll get that small shadow in that indentation to the left side and continue on the right side. And we'll shape the bottom of the pepper and drag that color to the right to create the shape of the shadow. Now we'll soften the outer edge. And while that's wet, we'll add some red reflection in the cast shadow. Now we'll add some black just under the pepper and let that bleed into the rest of the shadow. We need to soften the outer edges a little more. And now soften the bottom edge of the pepper just a little. That looks good. I'll replenish our middle gray color and we'll paint the cast shadow for the jar. This shadow is lighter and has some variations of light and dark with more soft blended edges. We'll start with the middle value gray just under the jar. There's 3 dark shapes that blend into the white paper. We'll add those in and soften all the edges. We'll dab a touch of the dark gray into that furthest shadow shape. We'll add a touch of black at the bottom of the jar. And we are finished with the cast shadows. So we could be finished at this point, but there's a couple of things that I want to refine. I want to add some darker form shadows on that yellow pepper. I think it's good to show you that we can still add things over dry paint if we need to. So I'll mix a dark shadow color using yellow-orange plus some violet. And we'll just hit all of those core shadows on the front of the pepper. And soften the edges with a clean, damp brush. While we're at it, we'll mix a dark red by adding some green to it. And paint some darker areas on the red pepper, around the stem, then soften the edges. Now we'll add just a few dabs of black to the jar. And I think we're finished. It's a simple still life with just 3 objects, but it's a challenge compared to the previous lessons we've done. I hope you all tried this and had success with your paintings. I also hope you had fun and learned something you can use in the future. If so, please subscribe and join me again for the next lesson. Thanks for watching and have a wonderful day.